It's crazy. After all these years, the Kennedy assassination still feels kind of inescapable.
It's true. It's like this event, it just captures the imagination even decades later.
And you would think, with how much it's been investigated, how much has been written about it, we'd have it all figured out by now.
Right. You'd think so.
Yeah.
But the questions, they just don't seem to go away.
Exactly. And that's why we're diving into the Warren Report for this deep dive. It's the official investigation, thousands of pages, supposed to give us the definitive answer. So no better place to start, right?
Absolutely. This was the investigation, the one tasked with getting to the bottom of what happened in Dallas that day.
November 22nd, 1963. A date that, it's seared into the consciousness of this country.
Absolutely. The assassination of President Kennedy, it sent shockwaves across the world. The impact was immense.
And in response, you had the Warren Commission, this group of highly respected figures chosen to investigate every single angle of the assassination.
Their goal was to sift through everything, all the chaos, all the conflicting information, and try to provide some clarity.
And ultimately, when you get right down to it, the Warren Report's biggest conclusion, the one that underpins everything else, is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in shooting President Kennedy.
That's right. No conspiracy, no second shooter, just Oswald.
Which I'm sure for some people listening, that's where the questions really start.
Oh, absolutely. Because how do you prove a negative, right? How do you definitively say that someone didn't have help, that there wasn't something more going on behind the scenes?
It's like trying to prove you don't have a secret twin. Like, where do you even begin?
Exactly. But the Warren Report, they really tried to build their case methodically, step by step. And one of the most crucial pieces of evidence, of course, is the rifle.
Okay, so the rifle. Found on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, the building where Oswald was working that day. Now, I know some people are thinking too convenient, right? Like, of course they found the rifle.
Right. It does seem a little pat, but stick with me. This is where it gets interesting. That rifle, a Mannlicher Carcano, it was traced back to Oswald. He'd purchased it by mail order a few months earlier.
So they have the murder weapon, and it's connected to Oswald, but can they place him at the scene of the crime when it happened?
That's the next piece of the puzzle. And they use eyewitness accounts to try to do that. People who were in Dealey Plaza that day who saw what happened, or at least they thought they did.
And enough of those witnesses, according to the report, they place Oswald in that 6th floor window of the depository at the time of the shooting.
That's what they concluded. These eyewitness accounts, they became central to the case against Oswald.
But this is the deep dive, and we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't bring up the conspiracy theories. And I think one of the most prevalent, most debated aspects of the assassination is this idea of a second shooter on the grassy knoll.
Right, this idea that Oswald wasn't alone, that there was someone else firing shots that day.
So how does the Warren Report address that? Did they just ignore it?
No, they directly address it, and they refute it. They looked at the angles, the bullet trajectories, the science of it all, and they concluded that all 3 shots fired that day came from that 6th floor window where Oswald was.
Okay, so 3 shots. Is that something the report explicitly states? That detail alone has been debated for years.
They do. 3 shots, and they pinpoint the 3rd shot as the fatal one. And they base this on witness statements, forensic analysis of the bullets, everything. It's a key part of their timeline.
So we've got Oswald, we've got the rifle, we've got eyewitness accounts. But the assassination wasn't the only shooting that happened that day.
You're right. Shortly after Kennedy was killed, you have the shooting of Officer J.D. Tippit. Completely different location, but the Warren Report draws a direct line between those 2 events.
This is where things get even more complex. So how do they connect Oswald to the Tippit shooting?
Witnesses. People who saw the shooting identified Oswald as the man who shot Officer Tippit. And once again, ballistics comes into play. The gun used to kill Officer Tippit traced back to Oswald.
So 2 shootings, 2 different firearms, both linked to Oswald on the same day. It creates this image of a man acting impulsively, violently. Does the report see the Tippit shooting as significant beyond just, hey, he also did this?
They do. They state outright that it's a critical piece of evidence because it reinforces their conclusion that Oswald was acting alone. Like, this wasn't some elaborate plan with other people. This was impulsive, in their view.
It deepens the mystery of Oswald's motives, though, right?
Yeah.
Because if he acted alone, and the Tippit shooting suggests he did, then the question becomes, why? What could drive someone to do something like this?
And that's the million-dollar question. That's what we're going to get into next. Because the Warren Report, they don't just lay out the events. They try to get inside Oswald's head.
They try to understand the why. So we've established the what, at least according to the Warren Report, but now we're in the realm of why.
Right. And this is where the report, it gets really interesting because they try to paint this picture of Oswald, and it's not pretty.
They don't hold back.
Right.
Difficult childhood, his time in the Marines, defecting to the Soviet Union. It's all in there.
They really do try to lay out his entire life looking for clues, and it's hard, right? Because you're trying to get inside the mind of someone who's no longer here to explain themselves.
Yeah, and you're trying to find these subtle connections between, like, he had a rough childhood and he assassinated the president.
Exactly. And it's not just the broad strokes of his life either. They dig into his personal writings. There's this diary he kept, his historic diary. They really comb through it looking for insights.
It's like they're treating it almost as a confession of sorts.
Kind of, yeah. Like maybe if we can just decode this, we'll understand why. And they also consulted psychological evaluations.
Really? Like trying to understand his state of mind retroactively.
Right, because that's the thing. They had to rely on these secondhand accounts, these pieces of a puzzle, to try and create this complete picture of who Oswald was and what might have led him down this path.
But one of the biggest questions for a lot of people, and a major focus of a lot of those conspiracy theories we talked about, is whether Oswald was working with anyone else. Was he part of a larger group or plan?
Right. Was he just a pawn in some larger game? Did someone put him up to this?
So after all that investigation, did the Warren report find any evidence of a conspiracy?
Despite looking at his connections, his past, any potential ties to groups that might have wanted Kennedy dead, they found nothing conclusive. Their official stance is that Oswald acted alone.
Which begs the question, if it was all him, if he wasn't taking orders from someone, what was it all for?
It's the million-dollar question, right? And to be honest, the Warren report doesn't really offer a satisfying answer. They suggest, and this is based on their reading of his writings, his diary, that it was this combination of things. Personal frustrations, disillusionment with, well, pretty much everything.
So a guy who was just angry at the world, basically.
In a way, yeah. But they also suggest this other element, which is kind of unsettling.
Which is?
That he wanted to make a mark on history, that he wanted to be remembered.
So you're saying he assassinated the president to become famous?
I know, it sounds crazy, but the report argues that for someone like Oswald, who clearly had a lot of, let's say, issues, this need for notoriety might have been a driving factor.
Do they back that up with anything specific? Like, did he ever say he wanted to be famous?
They point to his writings. He seemed to believe that his actions would have this, like, world-changing impact, that he would be remembered as this major historical figure. And tragically, he wasn't wrong, but, I mean, not in the way anyone would want.
It's a chilling thought, to be honest.
Yeah.
That someone could be driven to do something so horrific because they want their name in the history books. But, I mean, we're not even done with the craziness of this story, are we? Because we have another shooting to talk about.
Oh, yeah, we can't forget about Jack Ruby. As if the assassination itself wasn't shocking enough.
You had the murder of the alleged assassin. I mean, that's just unbelievable.
Right. Like something out of a movie. Days after the assassination, Oswald's being transferred, and Jack Ruby, this Dallas nightclub owner, just walks up and shoots him.
On live television.
On live television. I mean, the whole thing is just, it's surreal.
So the Warren report, they had to address this too, right? Because it just throws this whole other wrench into everything.
Of course. I mean, suddenly you have this whole other layer of questions. Did Ruby know Oswald? Was he working with someone? Was this part of some elaborate cover-up?
Like something out of a spy novel.
Right. And they looked into Ruby just as deeply as they looked into Oswald. They wanted to know his background, his connections, his motives. Did he have ties to organized crime? Was he hired to silence Oswald?
And what did they find?
Well, just like with Oswald, they concluded that Ruby acted alone, that he wasn't part of some grand conspiracy.
Okay, so no puppet master pulling the strings.
Not that they could find.
Then what was Ruby's motive? Why kill Oswald?
They propose this theory, and it's kind of out there. They suggest that Ruby was driven by grief over Kennedy's death, that he saw herself as some kind of avenging angel.
An avenging angel? Shooting someone in cold blood? Seems a little extreme. Did they address his mental state at all?
Yeah, that became a big point of contention. Some on the commission believed that Ruby was mentally unstable, that his actions were a product of, mental illness, but they could never definitively say that that was the sole factor.
So we're left with these two individuals, both seemingly acting on their own, driven to these acts of violence. It's a lot to process.
It really is, and I think that's part of why this event continues to fascinate us. It just doesn't fit neatly into any category.
Like trying to solve a puzzle, but you're missing half the pieces.
Exactly, and yet we keep trying to put it together to make sense of it all.
It's almost like we're looking for order in something that was inherently chaotic.
Exactly, and trying to impose some kind of narrative on something that might not have one, or at least not a neat and tidy one.
And speaking of narratives, we can't talk about the Kennedy assassination without talking about the role of the media, because this was really the first major event of its kind to play out on television, right?
Absolutely. This was broadcast news in its early stages, suddenly thrust onto the world stage. And the impact of that, of seeing those images, hearing those reports, it was huge.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like, to experience something so momentous, so tragic, through this new lens of instant information.
And it wasn't just the news reports either. You had photographs splashed across newspapers, magazine covers. It was everywhere. It saturated the culture.
So the media, in a way, it becomes part of the story.
Without a doubt. And the Warren Report, they actually addressed this. They criticize how information was handled, particularly by the Dallas Police Department, in those crucial hours and days after the assassination.
Like they were overwhelmed by the media attention.
In a way, yeah. They argue that by releasing certain details to the press prematurely, without context, it just fueled speculation. It created this atmosphere where rumors could spread like wildfire.
And potentially even bias public opinion against Oswald before he ever had a chance to, defend himself.
Exactly. The court of public opinion, it was moving fast.
Which, I mean, that's a whole other conversation about the intersection of media and justice. But for the purposes of our deep dive here, the point is, the Warren Report itself acknowledges that this media frenzy, it wasn't just a sideshow. It played a role.
Right. It was a factor. And, it even makes you think about Jack Ruby?
The guy who shot Oswald?
Right. We have to remember Ruby, he was a nightclub owner. Someone used to attention to being in the spotlight.
So you're saying he was drawn to the cameras, to the chaos.
It's impossible to say for sure, but it's an interesting thought because here you have this guy surrounded by reporters, by this media circus, and he inserts himself into the middle of it all.
By shooting the most famous person on the planet at that moment.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, for someone wired like Ruby, that wasn't insignificant. The need to be at the center of the story, it's a chilling thought.
It is. But it speaks to the power of the media, for sure. For good or for ill.
Right. And the need to be critical consumers of information. To not just accept what we see and hear, but to question it, to dig deeper. Because, as we've seen with the Warren Report, even with the best intentions, there are always going to be limitations.
Speaking of limitations, the Warren Report itself wasn't immune to criticism, right?
Yeah.
Even though it was this massive undertaking, there were people who disagreed with its findings.
Oh, absolutely. And there still are. Some people question the commission's impartiality, arguing that they were too quick to dismiss evidence that contradicted their conclusion about Oswald acting alone.
So basically, even with all that evidence they presented, some people still believe there was a conspiracy.
Some people just weren't convinced. They felt like there were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. And to be fair, there still are.
Which kind of makes you wonder, is it even possible to have a definitive account of something like this? I mean, we're talking about a complex event, multiple players, political motivations. It's not exactly a simple math equation.
Exactly. And I think that's part of why the Kennedy assassination continues to fascinate and frustrate people, because we want answers, we crave certainty, and sometimes we have to accept that we might never get it.
That the truth might be lost somewhere in the chaos, in the fog of time.
Maybe. But that doesn't mean we stop searching. And that's the beauty of history, right? It's an ongoing conversation. We keep revisiting these events. We keep asking questions. And maybe, just maybe, we get a little closer to understanding.
Well, it's a pretty good note to end on, I'd say. A little closer to understanding, even if it's just understanding how much we don't know.
Exactly. And embracing that uncertainty, that ambiguity.
Yeah.
Because that's part of what makes history so fascinating.
It's been quite a deep dive. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for going on this journey with us. And as we always say, this isn't the end of the conversation. It's just the beginning. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and until next time, keep diving deep.